Hello, and welcome to Good Conversations. My name is Thompson Smith. We'll be talking today with Dr. Steve Running of the University of Montana, one of the world's leading scientists on an issue of the greatest importance, not only to Montana, but to the entire planet: climate change and global warming. We've all noticed that our winters aren't what they used to be, and the heat this past summer was something none of us has ever seen before in Montana. I've heard this issue raised and discussed by people from every background in our community: tribal elders, farmers and ranchers, natural resource professionals, loggers, hunters, fishermen. Professor Running heads the Numerical Terradynamics Simulation Group at UM's College of Forestry and Conservation. Since 2004, he served as one of the lead authors of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, the branch of the United Nations first established in 1988 to focus on this issue. On October 12, 2007, it was announced that the Nobel Peace Prize was being awarded jointly to the IPCC, including Steve Running, and former Vice President Al Gore for their work on global warming. We are honored to have Steve Running with us today in the studios of SKC-TV Public Television. Welcome, Dr. Running.
Thank you.
Congratulations on this tremendous honor.
Yes, it was certainly a surprise to all of us scientists.
I'll bet it was. Well, I'm glad that we're going to have an hour with you today, so we'll air the first half hour this week and the next half hour the following week. Thank you for taking this time with us. Now for our audience, let's just start with the basics. How would you describe the greenhouse effect in basic terms and the global warming phenomenon?
Yeah, the greenhouse effect label was tagged to this many decades ago because it really explains what happens fairly well to anybody who's familiar with a greenhouse or a car sitting in the sun for that matter. And it's the basic physics that shortwave energy, sunlight, comes through glass and comes through our atmosphere, and pretty transparently, almost completely transparently, and then hits the ground, and the ground then emits long wave or thermal energy back. Well, the long wave energy, being a different wavelength, does not go back through the glass, and so it's trapped by a greenhouse. So you can have a greenhouse out in the sun when it's 20 or 30 below zero air temperature outside, and when the sun's on that greenhouse can easily be 90 or 100 degrees inside. And it's simply because the thermal radiation cannot go back through the glass. Well, this is really the simplest explanation of what the atmosphere does, in that the long wave radiation from the Earth's surface does not go through the atmosphere back to radiate into space. It's trapped by the atmosphere. Now, the second part of what's important here is that carbon dioxide is one of a number of gases that has these greenhouse effect properties, that they allow shortwave radiation through, but they absorb and trap long-wave radiation. This has been known since 1896, so this is not wild new theoretical physics at all. It was a well-known phenomenon. A guy named Svante Arrhenius, who was a previous Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, actually postulated the entire global warming effect way back then.
And in fact, the greenhouse effect is necessary for life as we know it on Earth, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I forget the exact facts, but if we had no atmosphere, the Earth would be 100 degrees colder or something like that. And so some greenhouse trapping of heat is essential for us to survive here. What we have found is now happening, and this started with a critical data set from Mauna Loa, Hawaii, that began in 1957, is this showed that the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is just going up year by year by year. And so the issue here is that the atmosphere is trapping more and more of this thermal heat every year because CO2 is going up in the atmosphere more and more.
And is that the strongest evidence that global warming is occurring? The CO2 measurements at Mauna Loa, or I mean, what are some of the strongest bodies of evidence for this phenomenon?
The CO2 increase is our best evidence of what's causing global warming. The actual measurements of warming trends are best looked at first with simple temperature records. The National Weather Service measurements that are taken at airports and towns and cities all over the U.S. and all over the world. There's something like 8,000 officially reporting weather stations worldwide, for example. And so that's the strongest evidence of warming itself. The second evidence that we've found to be very important and easily followed is changes in snow and ice cover, the cryosphere, because that's so easy to see. When snow disappears, when a glacier retreats, when sea ice melts, you can see it with the naked eye. And so those are the two best lines of evidence, the basic temperature records and then these cryospheric measurements of the warming.
They both show a consistent rise over the period that's been measured.
Fairly consistent. It is not perfectly consistent, of course, because there's some differences in different parts of the world. And so, for example, I think 95% of the glaciers on Earth are retreating, but there are 5% that aren't. And so in climatology, there's enough natural variability that not every station, not every glacier ever fits the pattern exactly.
I see. And these records have been taken, I imagine, for maybe a century and a half. But of course, climate cycles on Earth, the Earth's history is over 4 billion years. So how do you deal with those long variations in climate?
Right. We have temperature, good thermometer records. The mercury thermometer was invented, if I remember right, in the 1600s or something like that. And so we have good air temperature records for, say, a few 200 years or so. We have observations of snow and ice cover that have been recorded fairly carefully for something like the same, around 200 years. When we go back further, we have to look at various proxies, various ways that we can infer the temperature conditions. And scientists have worked tremendously hard over many decades with a lot of very amazing measurements. One of the most amazing is they've drilled ice cores in Antarctica and a few other places. And these are a core about, I think, 5 inches or so in diameter that go all the way to the bottom of the Antarctic glaciers. And they go back 600,000 years. They're able to analyze the chemistry of the atmosphere and the bubbles of the ice. And by looking at isotopic ratios and things like that, they can infer to a fair accuracy what the average temperatures of the planet were for 600,000 years.
And I imagine also what the CO2 levels were in the atmosphere.
Yes.
Parts per million?
Right. And they can also measure pretty directly the CO2 concentrations back through that whole period.
Okay. So that's 600,000 years, and the entire span of Homo sapiens on Earth is about 100,000, I guess. Is that?
I'm not an anthropologist. It's that or less, that's for sure.
That or less.
Something like that.
So it's at least 500,000 years longer than the span of human existence on Earth. That's very interesting. And tell me what the CO2 levels have shown, the changes in those levels over this time.
Well, I think through the entire 600,000 year record, the average atmospheric CO2 is about 300 parts per million. And when we started the industrial age, say about 100 years ago, it was a little higher than that, not much. As I remember, about 320 parts per million. We're now at 385 parts per million, and every single year since the Mauna Loa record started, it's gone up. Not one year has it ever stayed even or gone down.
And at what level do scientists start pulling their hair out in concern over CO2 levels in the atmosphere?
You know, that's a question that world political leaders have asked us repeatedly. Can we define a specific critical threshold of 500 parts per million or 700 parts per million? And with scientific credibility, we really can't do that very well. We feel for most instances, this is just a continuing progression of higher CO2 and higher temperatures. That there are a few activities such as acidification of the ocean, where there have been some estimates that right at around 450 parts per million, coral reefs would quit growing. And so there's a little bit of evidence for a few thresholds, but by and large, this is a continuing issue where it's hard to define a single CO2 threshold.
That would be a real tipping point of some.
That would be a clearly defined real tipping point.
Okay. Let's take a quick break now. We'll be back in one moment. Don't go anywhere. And we're back, having a good conversation with one of the leading authorities on global warming, Dr. Steve Running of the University of Montana. And we're lucky to have Dr. Running in Montana and here at SKC-TV. Thanks, Dr. Running. Just before the break, we were talking about the rate of growth in CO2 emissions, and you were describing it as a progression. About how many parts per million, I guess the historic average through most of human history, through the 99% of human history that was dominated by hunter-gatherer societies, including right here until very recently, was 280 to 300 parts per million, somewhere in there.
Right.
And now we're up to 385, you said.
Right.
I've heard some people say that we're over 400 already. Are there some disagreements on where CO2 levels are right now?
No, that's actually something we know very well. The atmosphere mixes pretty completely around the Earth pretty rapidly, and so there's fluctuation from summer to winter. We can see in the atmospheric CO2 record in the summertime, photosynthesis by land plants draws it down by a few parts per million. And then in the wintertime, decomposition and respiration outgasses a few parts per million. And so we see in the entire global atmosphere a bit of fluctuation from summer to winter, but the overall average CO2 is pretty consistent around the world because the atmosphere mixes so completely.
Now, these graphs that are tracking the rise in CO2 levels, from some sources I've heard the rate of growth is increasing, so we're kind of entering an exponential rate of growth or something now, that, you know, where it was gradual for a long time, now we've kind of gone around the bend of that curve and are really shooting up. Is that true or not?
Yeah, we're actually pretty concerned about that trajectory. For the IPCC climate simulations, their scenarios, as they were called, were defined of where we think human activity will go in the next 100 years, and predominantly the part of this scenario that was important to the climate models was the rate of increase of CO2. And right now we are exceeding the rate of CO2 that was projected in the IPCC scenarios for really the most aggressive business as usual development, and so that is not good.
So scientists are now recording levels of CO2 increase that are worse than the worst projections of the IPCC.
And levels of CO2 emission. We know the emissions from human activity really pretty well. Oil and coal and natural gas are valuable enough that they measure how much is being consumed, and so that's a well-known number.
Okay. And just to touch again on the tipping point question that we were addressing before the break, sometimes I've heard people express concern about these tipping points, that once certain dynamics begin to occur, it becomes difficult, if not impossible, to turn the whole thing around. One of the tipping points that I've heard mentioned is the disappearance of sea ice during the summer months, especially, I guess,
Right.
up in the Arctic. And this past summer, wasn't there some enormous area of melting that had never been seen before?
Yes, we set an all-time record low for Arctic Ocean sea ice. We have about a 25-year history that taken by satellites mapping the areal extent of the sea ice every summer. And this last summer just plummeted farther than anybody ever thought could be possible in 1 year. And so the Earth system is, of course, very large and complex, and we might be past the tipping point now.
Because once that open black seawater is exposed to sunlight, the problem is what?
Yeah, well, it's very easy to see when you're up in a jet airplane, up way above the surface, that a snow-covered surface is white like a mirror and reflects most of the solar energy. But water looks almost black, as you say, and absorbs almost all the solar energy that hits that surface is absorbed by that water. So now we're progressively having the Arctic Ocean in open water instead of sea ice, and that's a lot of energy that's going into that ocean year after year after year with these progressive sea ice retreats.
I imagine that's just an enormous concern for you and other people working on this issue.
Well, the people that specialize in the Arctic research, they're the ones that have seen these dynamics firsthand, and yeah, they think that we may already be at a tipping point where we're going to progressively lose not only sea ice cover, but land snow cover.
We have so much to cover here, and we obviously can't cover everything with global warming in a short program, but let me just very quickly touch on the nature of your expertise at the University of Montana and also your role within the IPCC. Could you just quickly tell viewers what that is?
Briefly, I was trained as a forest ecologist, and early in my career here at University of Montana, I started working with NASA in the Earth Observing System. And so for these last 20 years, most of what my lab does is write software for processing satellite imagery, Earth satellite imagery for NASA. And so currently we calculate photosynthesis of the whole world every day. And we also calculate a water balance variable of evapotranspiration every day. And so those are how I got into global change research, was by being part of this NASA Earth Observing System program since 1981.
I see. And within the IPCC, what's the nature of your role there?
My official title was lead author for the chapter on climate change impacts for North America.
I see. And has any data emerged since the issuing of those reports a year ago that would change any of your conclusions or change the degree of your conclusions?
To some extent, yes. This topic is so hot that new papers are coming out almost monthly. The ink wasn't even dry on a report last spring, and there were new estimates out of the rate of sea level rise. And then, of course, as you mentioned, the precipitous drop in the Arctic ocean sea ice was headlines in the earth science community last summer. And so this topic doesn't hold still, and to some extent a few of these key measurements, they're even somewhat different than what we wrote last spring.
And unfortunately, the news isn't that things are happening more slowly, but actually more quickly. Is that correct in general or not?
I think that is a general statement that we just see, and I'd have to say are nervous about, is we seem to never find something going slower than we thought. It seems like whenever a trend of whatever it might be, whether it be glacier retreats or wildfires in the west or whatever it is, it seems like any new news seems to always be more ominous, not less.
Yeah. And speaking of forest fires in the west and things like that, I'd like you to, if you could, quickly spell out for viewers why this issue matters right here in Montana. What difference is it going to make in people's lives? And could you begin by addressing glaciers and snowpack and what's projected in that area?
Well, as I started my reading for the IPCC work and started trying to read across an array of disciplines, it became progressively clear that the trend I think we're getting in Montana starts with our snowpack melting earlier in the spring, and it seems like in the last 50 years our snowpack is now melting 2 to 4 weeks earlier. There's obviously year-to-year variation. As that snow melts earlier, of course the forests then start to dry out. When there's snow on the ground, nothing's going to burn. But as the snow melts earlier, our forests are drying out for a longer period of time through the spring. And then when the summer lightning storms hit, you have a whole landscape, a bigger landscape to higher elevation that is dry and ignitable. And so then we end this sequence with more fires that because the landscape is drier overall, and there is a lot of fuel built up from years and decades of fire suppression, we're getting fires that we can't control anymore. Some of these fires just cannot be controlled by any amount of money.
It's getting scary at times, I know that. We'll have to get back to impacts in a bit, but we're getting towards the end of our first program here, and we'll be continuing this conversation next week. But let me just take a moment now, as we will each week, to ask questions submitted by viewers and community members. And if you viewers today would like to get on our email list so that you can submit questions, please email us at goodtalk@blackfoot.net. And we'll be sure to let you know about upcoming guests and topics, and we would welcome any questions or comments you might have for us. Well, one of the questions submitted to us for this week is from someone who attended a Clark Fork River Task Force meeting recently and reported that there were more skeptics than believers on the issue of global warming at this meeting. And she asked if I could ask you to explain why the data conclusively shows that this is not simply a natural warming trend and that the change is, without a doubt, human-induced.
I think the clearest evidence that we have that this is not natural is because all of these warming trends are just pervasive worldwide. If we were looking at normal natural variability of, say, glaciers, it would be normal for maybe half of them to be retreating, but the other half to be expanding. And that just isn't the case. As we look at these various metrics of warming, we see the vast preponderance of stations and measurements worldwide all going the same direction. And I think that, on top of the fact that we clearly have CO2 rising in the atmosphere, that's uncontested. It's measured in hundreds of places around the world. And so we have a physical mechanism that clearly is an explanation for a warming trend, and we have evidence that we look at that shows warming all around where we look globally, and we just don't see nearly enough cooling trends anywhere to counteract what would be normal natural variability.
I see. And Dr. Hansen of NASA recently was at the University of Montana, and he said that there's also a lot of evidence in Earth science, basically, Earth history, that going back millions of years or hundreds of millions of years, indicating the same thing, that the forcings of temperature change now are so much more rapid. Is that, did I understand that correctly?
He's much better expert to explain some of these details than I am. But in the look through paleoclimatology back tens of millions of years, they understand where much of the natural variability, really most of the natural variability, comes from. And it's orbital cycles around the sun that change, the Earth wobbles, its tilt on the axis,
and we're going to have
volcanic.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Running.
Right.
I'm new at this, but we'll have to continue that thought next time.
Okay.
I want to thank Dr. Running for being with us here today and taking the time to explain such an issue of enormous importance. Again, thank you, viewers, and if you wish to send comments or questions, send them to goodtalk@blackfoot.net. Thanks for watching.